All right, there we go. Sorry about that. Well, welcome to Smooth-On's YouTube live presentation, Making Clear Casting and Casting Effects. My name is Janessa Portner. I'm a material technician here at Smooth-On. Heather Hanna will be helping lend a hand through the event. Alex Hazard is working our cameras today, and Jason Reese, along with our phenomenal support team, will be helping answer your questions in the chat. We will do our best to get to your questions, but if you need additional material support or you have questions about your specific project, don't hesitate to reach out to our technical support line, and you can even send us an email through our ticketing system. Our contact information can be found on our website, smooth-on.com, but we're also going to put up links in the chat as we go to make it as easy as possible for you to access the information we're talking about today. So there are many reasons why you might want to make clear castings, from simulating glass, water, or just creating different color effects, or even encapsulating materials in clear resin. Casting in clear and translucent materials can be very challenging, but it can also be a lot of fun. Today we're going to talk about some of those challenges and work with the materials to try and understand which ones might work best for your project or why you might want to use a different type of clear casting material over another one. So that being said, why don't we review what we're actually going to do in today's presentation. First, we're going to talk about some clear urethane materials and why you might want to use one liquid tool over the other. We're also then going to discuss how some of those different surface qualities of your original model can affect those castings. We're going to work on those different preparation options and see how those effects result in what the outcome is that you cast into your mold. We're also going to then go over some of the equipment that's used to reduce the bubbles that can get trapped in clear materials, such as vacuum degassing equipment. And we're going to talk about pressure casting chambers as well and walk through the process of how you use them. We're also going to look at some colored examples to see different color options you can get of those different effects. And we're going to make some epoxy encapsulations and see what those look like when you coat materials in clear resin that are fully encapsulated in a structure. And some of them aren't in structures as well, and that's part of the fun. We're then going to have some fun with our silicone encapsulations too, and see the different effects you can get with the silicones that you can pour to encapsulate materials as well. And there might be a little surprise there at the end as that will make an impact in the presentation. But we're going to take a look at what we're going to learn today. So at the end of our clear casting and casting effects presentation, you'll know what it is that you're going to get out of that outcome. If we could go ahead and put up that. So the materials that we're going to cover for the presentation are going to feature urethane systems, our SmoothCast 325, 326, and 327 color match materials, our Task 9. We're going to talk about our Crystal Clear and Clear Flex industrial specialty resins as well, and our Smash Plastic. We're going to take a look at our silicone encapsulation materials, our Encapso K and our rubber glass, and the epoxies, the tar bender system and the EpoxyCast 690. We're going to use a few different additives today. We're going to pigment these materials with our So Strong colorants, our UVO pigments, and show some examples with the Ignite colorants. And we have some other featured additives for those systems, such as our Cryptolyte, Quarrytone. You're going to see some Cast Magic, and even our Urethane 7 featured today as well. So now that we know a little bit of what we're going to get out of the presentation and the materials that we're going to use, why don't we take a look at some of these direct comparisons that we have here on the table. So right up front, we have the sculptural piece that you can see has some different color variation occurring. So these are the materials themselves that we were just talking about. So the Crystal Clear, you can see featured in these two examples. And the Crystal Clear series is a water clear material. So something that you'll see here and why their color's a little different is that this example is water clear all the way through. So you can see that glossy surface quality on the back. This example has actually been lightly abraded and sanded, so there is a little bit of opacity just on that back surface. Same material, slightly different appearance effect. Now, before we go further, I do want to talk about some of the differences in the terminology, because when you're trying to describe clear materials, it can be very difficult to understand verbally. So I have some examples here that we're going to take a look at. This is water clear, like that example I was just showing you. This is our crystal clear series. And when I hold up the lens, you can see my hand and the light pass completely through it. In fact, it has an optical effect where it's making the image slightly smaller, right? But that's a clear material. That's a water clear material, like you were going to pour a nice clean glass of pure water. Now, this example is translucent. I'm going to show you that translucence coming through with the help of a little light so that you can see light is passing through the object, but I'm not really getting any visual information. So this is a translucent option, where this one is completely opaque. When I go to pass light through it, nothing happens. It is an opaque material. You're not getting any information through that, right? So there are times where you might want a clear example, times where you might be looking for a translucent one, and times where you're looking for an opaque one. We're not going to be able to make an opaque material clear or translucent, but we can add some opacity with our clear materials, and that's something we're going to do in just a little bit. Now, these examples are not water clear. They are clear, however, they've been colored. So you can see through them. Let me see if we can get that on the camera. You can see my hand pass through it. You can see light is completely passing through this example, but it's been pigmented, it's been colored. The only difference between that and this example is just that there's a little bit more color added to the system. So you can see that this one is darker in appearance. So how we add these fillers and how we add these colorants are going to have a direct aesthetic effect on the castings that we get. So I'm going to move on then to our next material, which is our Smooth Cast 325, 326, and 327 all have the same coloration. And these are what we call clear amber materials. Instead of being water clear, they're still a completely clear material, but they have a slight amber tint to it. And we refer to this as a color match material because it's very easy to add the pigment you see. So these are Smooth Cast 325 examples that have been colored. If you're looking for a clear result, but you don't mind adding coloration to it, or you're looking for an amber appearance, the Smooth Cast 325, 326, and 327, they all have different pot lives and cure times. So you're going to have more working time with the Smooth Cast 326 and the Smooth Cast 327 if you're using additional equipment like that vacuum degassing and pressure casting equipment we're going to talk about. This example is a little darker in appearance, and this is a higher performance color match material called Task 9. So it's still clear, it's that clear amber, and it actually cures to a slightly firmer result than the Smooth Cast 325 series. Unlike that series, there's just the one product that has this unique properties and comes from our Task series. It's the only Task product that you can get a clear amber result with. Now, I want to talk a little bit about those aesthetic effects. So I have an example here that's been pigmented a little bit, but even though it's a clear material, you're not going to be able to completely see through it because it has some bubble entrapment in the material that's adding opacity to it. One of the reasons I have this example here is because there are times where if you're simulating glass, like a soda bottle colored glass in this example, there may be times to create that effect and appearance of glass, you would actually want to have some bubbles in your part for believability, or depending on the effect and the outcome that you're ultimately going for. So same material, colored and with no bubbles in it gives you a completely clear result. And then sometimes when bubbles occur, it can add some opacity, which can benefit your project as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about those bubbles and how you can reduce them, or what different types of bubbles may look like that you might be seeing. Because again, it's pretty hard to describe just in words, so we have the advantage here of being able to look at some examples together. But I do want to point out, before we move on, that when you have a clear material, because you can see through it and you're seeing the front and the back simultaneously, to get that clear effect, you're going to want to be aware of what your surface texture is. So this is a flat material. It's a liquid, so it's flat on the top, but the back is very highly textured, so you can see all that texture there coming through. So if you wanted a clear result and you didn't want the texture to distract, something you may be thinking of is how you can control that textural information on both sides of your piece so that you can make a result that gives you the information that you want on both sides. So let's say, for example, something like this example here, where you can see both the outside surface and the inside surface. So for a clear result, we're not just thinking about the outmost part of the piece, we're actually thinking about how it looks all the way through. Hopefully that makes sense. So you make a mold and you're excited and you're ready to use it and you go to cast into it, and you may realize that the results that you have, although you have a clear material that you've poured, are actually slightly not clear on the surface. You're getting some opacity there. And that's because of the texture of your original model when you made your mold. So usually when I talk to people about clear castings, what they really want is a clear and glossy casting. So let me show you a comparison of what that looks like with the same clear material. So here I have a crystal matrix. It was made from this amethyst. And even though it's all clear, this is a crystal clear series of materials, you can see light passes all the way through that, completely clear. You have some different textures that are occurring. So it's not the material that's creating that effect, it's the information from the original model. So here I have the original model, right, the amethyst that it was made from. And when I made this mold, you can see that I have three major textures coming off the surface. I have a very highly crystal faceted texture. I have a very smooth polished texture, and I have a very rough texture. So in my casting, which is the information that came from the mold, I have all three of those surface textures represented. And this is where, if you have a model that is very porous and needs to be sealed, so very high porosity where the rubber can flow in, or let's say it's a wood grain, like you're doing a wood example and it has a whole lot of texture, that texture can ultimately lead to those results that you get on your casting. So I have an example here where you can also see that even though the model was a glass original, there's a very clear area that's very glossy, and then there are these other areas where the glass is frosted. Now, no additives were added to this at all. Those effects come from the original model that the mold is taking the information from. So I wanted to talk just roughly, for those of you who are new to mold making or have yet to make a mold, that in making a mold, we need an original model, such as the crystal that you see here. You're then going to make a mold of that, which is going to be in a watertight container that's going to go around the negative space. And then, when you've removed your model and taken it out of your mold, you then can reveal your casting. And we're going to need a watertight container because we're going to be pouring liquids. So here's the mold that came out of. And you can see it's very glossy in there, and you can also see the facets that were picked up in the crystal. So this is the original model. This is our MoldStar 16 Fast, which is a platinum silicone that I used to make the mold. And then the crystal clear was poured into this to get the result. You're going to see quite a few platinum silicone molds that I'm going to use today from the MoldStar series. In the case of the crystal clear series, it is a specialty resin that does have specific mold rubber recommendations. And the MoldStar 15, 16, and 30 are all compatible mold rubbers for use with this material. So I have a demonstration to better understand where those bubbles and how those bubbles may get into your liquid, like we were talking about. We're going to be mixing liquids today, and this is water, so there's no confusion with the water here. I want to show you that usually when you have a glass of water, you might notice that bubbles may stick to the surface tension of the glass, right? But other than that, once they float to the surface, you have a clear material. But when you mix the material and you go and pour it out of the faucet, that agitation that occurs when you're dispensing out the clear water also causes bubbles. Now you can see that, right? That water stream is the opaque part where all those bubbles are coming down, and because it's an extremely low viscosity material, floating up to the top and escaping. Well, the materials that we're going to mix are going to go from a liquid to a solid, and they're two-component materials. So when we mix the part A and the part B, and that liquid starts its chemical reaction, if it's very low viscosity, those bubbles can escape upwards, but we do have some tricks to help them along. So let's take a look at some of those different bubbles I was telling you about that you might see. One of my least favorite bubbles is the one that happens right on the surface. So when this mold was poured, it was poured this way, right? And the surface tension, just like in a glass of water, is right here at the top. Well, I had a bubble there that didn't make it out. And that bubble's there because of the surface tension. An easy way to help reduce that from occurring, if you have the option to do so, and you're going to see a tool that we're going to be using here today, is to use a propane torch to apply heat. Now, you're not letting the flame come in contact with the liquid, but you are allowing it to help break that surface tension by holding it a distance away, and that will release the bubbles. We're going to see that in the example that we're about to do, but I wanted to introduce you to this tool. Please observe all the safety requirements of any tool when you're working with it, but this can be used to help eliminate that bubble from occurring. And we're going to see that in our next demonstration. The act of mixing the material can also entrap bubbles. Now this one is similar to this example we saw here, where it was agitated and the bubbles that are in it are very, very, very fine. So they're really hard to see until you're right up on it. I don't know if the camera's picking up those very small microfine bubbles. Taking a look there. Looks pretty great, right? Well, something that can occur in a thicker casting is those very small bubbles can add up and add a little bit of opacity, which was perfect for this example. And that's why you can see them, right? Just some of those very small bubbles, microfine all the way throughout. Now, when you use additional equipment to help reduce the amount of air that's in your mix, or to make those bubbles even smaller, we can make those smaller than the visible eye if you're using pressure casting equipment. And we're going to go over that in just a moment. All right. Well, why don't we actually go ahead and do that mix so that you can see how these materials work? I'm not going to use any equipment. The Smoothcast 325 is very low viscosity, very easy to use. But with the different equipment, that can allow you to get something. This is Smoothcast 325, the material we're about to mix, that is water clear, right? I have two other types of bubbles to show you, one of which is material that was poured closer to the end of its pot life so that it was a little bit thicker. This is just a little bit more advanced, but this is really important to know about these materials. There is, with urethane systems, they're mass sensitive. So in the greatest amount of mass, the biggest thickness, it's going to set the fastest. Now that's actually the core, the center here. The thinnest section on this piece are going to be these edges. I actually cut a chunk out of this to show you that when this casting was pulled, those edges were the softest section. This is a helpful tip for mold makers to know that even if your casting may appear to have gone from a liquid to a solid fully, keep in mind in those thin sections, they may need more time to fully cure. And when you mix the liquids and start that pot life, the sooner that you can get your material into your mold, the more time those bubbles are going to have to float to the surface, just like that glass of water. Now, when you're using that additional equipment, the pressure casting equipment also, you're going to want to make sure that your mold was made under those same conditions. These bubbles are all on the outside, not on the inside. And that's because the mold wasn't prepared for the processes that we're ultimately doing our casting with. So when you think about your mold making project, to add some additional visualization tools, you want to think all the way through from the original material that you start with and the surface quality of it, to your mold rubber selection being compatible with your ultimate casting material, and that the mold is made under the same conditions that you're going to be casting it in. Okay, so right now, the casting that we're going to do isn't going to require that additional equipment. We're going to take a silicone mold that was made from a glossy original object. This is that Mold Star 16 that you just saw in that example. And we're going to mix up some Smoothcast 325 and pour into it. But I don't just want to pour into it. I want to do it in 2 layers. And we're going to mix 2 batches so that we can have opacity in some areas and translucence in others. So we're going to use the Urethane 7. So this is Smoothcast 325. This is what we're going to mix and do to accentuate some of the elements of the piece. There's no color added, even though this is a clear material, just like you see here. Normally it's very clear. We're going to add color to one layer, and we're going to add a filler to another to create opacity so that we can take a clear material and use it in 2 different ways. So I have some Smoothcast 325 right here. And why don't we mix up some? This is my favorite part. I do want to ask, while I'm getting this set up, have we had any questions in the chat that anybody would like to know more about off of anything that we started with today?
Not quite yet.
All right, well, good to know. Thank you guys for being here. So I have a part A and a part B with this material. And because we are using polyurethane chemicals, I'm going to be sure to have my safety equipment. So I've got gloves as well as glasses. And the urethane I was telling you about is a little different. make a little bit of space on the counter here. It's a powdered system that's sold in a box like this. And then the powder comes in the bag. And another place that we can get bubbles in our material from is the potential for moisture inhibition. So we have ambient moisture in the air. We have wood mixing sticks. Sometimes they can also, the wood, porosity of the wood can absorb that moisture and it can work its way into the material. So once you open the material, you're letting that humid air into the container and it'll eventually work its way into the material. So once you get your products, you actually want to use them closer to when you're doing your project. So the materials do have a shelf life. It's the part A is the moisture sensitive side. So we're going to add this dry powder to the part B. And this dry powder has been preheated so that it could remove any of that ambient moisture that it could absorb and make its way into the material. We don't want that. We don't want that extra moisture making its way in and causing bubbles or foaming in our polyurethane. So we've prepared this in advance as recommended on the technical bulletin. And we're going to dispense some of that out. So it's fully cooled now, it's room temperature. And that's important because temperature also affects how these materials work. It's gonna reduce that pot life, that cure time, how much time those bubbles have to escape in a warmer environment and extend it in a cooler environment. So we just need a little bit to create this white opaque result in the Smoothcast 325. We only need just a little bit of powder and just a little bit of resin because we're just going to fill in the fish in this koi tile. So put on my glasses and I'm going to dispense out the part A. Open up my material to that same visual amount. This is a by volume mix ratio. So you can see I'm not using an accurate gram scale. I'm just looking by eye. Very easy to use. And now my part B. And I'm going to add my additive to my part B. I'm just going to stir, mix that in, see if I can, there we go, move that a little forward so it's easier to see. So even though this is a clear material, by adding the Urethane 7, I'm adding opacity to it so that I can make it more translucent or even opaque. In this case, I wanted a little more opaque so that the colors of the fish are a little more defined. Now, I'm not in my pot life yet. I'm preparing my part B, so my two sides here haven't started reacting. They haven't started their pot life, but when I add them together, then I'm going to have that pot life, I believe it's 2.5 minutes with this material. All right. So I can mix those together. And you can see it's very low viscosity, very close to that water we poured. I believe it's 100 centipoise with this material. And very soon it's going to be going from a liquid to a solid, but right now we want to have a complete mix. So I'm going to do a double mix to help ensure I have as complete a mix as possible and transfer this mix to a new clean disposable cup so that I don't have any unmixed material sticking to the sides or the bottom of the cup.
Actually, someone's bringing up an interesting point. They use a lot of 320.
Mm-hmm.
Comparing 320, Smoothcast 320 with Smoothcast 325 that you're using here, the main difference is basically the color. This one's clear, right?
Right. That's an excellent point. The question is regarding some of the sister products in the Smoothcast series, that some of them are opaque to begin with. And if that's what you're looking for, if you're looking for opaque castings, then those are absolutely an option for you. So I'm doing a long, thin stream, and I'm just focusing a little bit where I want it to be. I'm underpouring just a little bit because I don't want to go over and have that flow into the areas that I want to look like water and remain clear. I just want to fill up the fish a little bit, and this will make it easier to paint then. So I want to be clear that I'm answering that question. Sometimes what you might be looking for is a different aesthetic effect. So with the Urethane 7 that I'm talking about here, we actually recommend these for marbling applications. I do have a marbled example that I can show you where color has been added, and this additional opacity helps that color really show through like a marble technique. We have a fantastic video on our website for that, so please feel free to check that out if you're interested in marbling applications. While this is setting up, I can show you that example. So because I'm doing a layered pour, I actually want to get my next layer on here at the end of the pot life. I want this material to have a faster pot life because I want to bond these two layers together. I don't want them to delaminate or separate. All right, so the material is starting to thicken up on me a little bit as it ends its pot life. So I'm just getting it roughly into some of those areas I want. And this last one here, if I go too slow, I don't want the material to entrap more bubbles or set up mid-pour. So I'm actually going to add just a little bit more. I'm going to get a clean mixing stick. And I'm just going to spot apply some of this right here into this tiniest bit in these little fins, because I just need it to be so thin as to go in there, just to accentuate. All right. So we filled that up with our initial layer. You can see a little bit is overflowing. That's okay. While it's in this liquid state, I can wipe just a little bit of it away. So that I can reveal this side underneath. And it's okay if a little bit gets there. I don't mind that at all. So now you're starting to see how each casting, even though it's the same shape, can be very unique and different. I'm going to use that tool that I was telling you about and just lightly let that heat release some of those bubbles that are coming up to the surface. Perfect. So as you can see, I'm just directing a little bit of heat. I'm not actually ever letting the flame come in contact with the surface, just enough to release that surface tension and allow those bubbles to come up to the top. So typically, the Urethane 7 for a marbling example can give you effects like this when it's colored, right? So if you were going to do this with the Smoothcast 320, the opaque off-white material we were just talking about that's opaque all the way through, you wouldn't be able to see the blending occur with that translucence. You would have a much more opaque result where you're only going to see that color blend on the surface. The nice aspect of using the Smoothcast 325 with the Urethane is that you can actually get more translucence in those layers to make it look more like a stone effect, for example. Hopefully that answered your question about the differences on those two materials. I don't have an example of Smoothcast 320 here, but I do have an example of the Smoothcast 325 that's been tinted and a sister product, the Smoothcast 300, which is bright white in appearance, right? So you can see what I mean. You can still pigment this and get some fantastic colors, but you're not going to be able to see through it to see those color layers. So this material is ending its pot life. It's transitioning from a liquid state to a solid state. So it's now lightly tacky, but it's solid, it's not going anywhere. So when I put down my new layer, I'm not going to displace any of the material that was underneath. So I do want to make it clear, as I was saying before, like with those examples, the mass of your casting, how much you're pouring and how much you're mixing, is going to have a direct result on how much time you're going to have to work with it. And so in this case, I knew we were doing a smaller piece, and having that shorter time frame made this ideal to be able to move on to that next layer quickly. So this is the fastest setting option in the Smoothcast 325 series. So this time, in this layer, we're going to add a little bit of colorant. And when I say a little bit of colorant, a little bit of So Strong goes a long way. So I'll show you how I do that too. I don't even use a full drop. So because we're not adding a filler, I can just dispense out my part A and my part B. So pour my part A. This time I'm going to need a little bit more because I want to fill in behind that area. There's a little bit more water there than there were fish. It's just the design of what we call the mold configuration. And again, it's a 1-to-1 by volume mix ratio. So I'm visually dispensing those out to the same amount. And this time I'm going to add a little bit of So Strong Blue. So Strong is the colorant that gives you a clear effect. So even though it's coloring the material, it's not adding that opacity. I have a comparison a little bit to some of the other colorants that we offer. We'll get to that in a moment. So if I just put a drop in there, that's going to be a lot of blue. So I don't want to do a full drop. I only want to do a partial drop. So to do that, I'm actually going to take just a little bit of that droplet, because I can't remove colorant once it's in there. I can add more. So I'm just lightly touching my stir stick with just a little bit of that pigment. I'll show you how much of a concentrated effect this really has. So let's see. Here we go. So I'm just going to mix that up. And you can see I'm already getting a nice water blue tint. And this is just a very small amount. So I'm still getting a blue, just even with that little bit of color. Now, I know that this is a thin section piece, so I actually do want it darker than this, but I wanted to show you that I can start from this point. And I actually recommend a small-scale color test. Whenever you're working with these materials before you jump into your project, doing a small test can tell you a lot about how it works in your environment. But I also will pour it out sometimes with my color concentration in different thicknesses. And I'll show you a little bit later, because you can get, with the same amount of color, in a thin section, it's going to appear much less concentrated than a thicker section, even if it's the same amount of color added to the mix. So I know this is going to be very thin. I'm going to do this again, and I'm going to add just a little bit more blue. Okay. Actually, I already have half a stir stick, so we'll just use the other half, and I'm going to do the same thing. Not a full drop, just going to let that lightly kiss the top of my stir stick with color. And now we should have a darker blue. Now, this is really only half the material, so I'm not trying to get an exact color. If I was going to do that, I would actually add it by weight with an accurate gram scale so I could get a consistent color. I am just getting in the ballpark. I'm going to combine that part A and that part B now that I have my color mixed in. Now I've started the pot life, so I want to make sure that I have a thorough mix by scraping the sides, the bottom, and I'm looking for those two separate part A and part B to combine into one uniform appearance. And just like before, I'm going to do a double mix. Transfer this to a new clean disposable mixing cup. You can see all those bubbles from that transfer rise right to the top, right? We want all those to escape our mold. But since this is more of an ocean scene, I'm okay if there's a little bit of bubbles in it. I think it makes it lifelike. I'm going to just mix a little bit more and transfer this to the mold. So I'm going to pour in a long, thin stream. It's referred to sometimes as a needling technique to try and reduce how many bubbles that I have, because bubbles that are bigger than that stream are going to pop on the way down, right? And I'm going to stay in the lowest point of my mold and then let the material move and rise to meet its level. And you can see those earlier layers, right, getting covered. Now the polyurethanes are very adhesive. We do sell urethane adhesives. So they're going to want to bond to each other because that initial layer is lightly tacky. The further I get from the cure time, the less likely they would want to bond.
If we had somebody on here who's interested in doing keycaps.
Oh, okay.
If you wanted to do multiple sets of keycaps or multiple castings and have them all look the same color, even if you couldn't cast everything in one day, how would you handle that?
That is a great question. First of all, I really enjoy embedding materials in encapsulations. So the neat thing about that is if you add your pigment to the part B, so if I wanted to, I could add out a specific amount of colorant that I've weighed out to my container, and that colorant will be there present in the part B and won't affect how the material is going to work when I mix it. I can get a consistent color every time I dispense out that same amount of material. Now, if you're doing keycaps, which are really, really small, that's where that precision is going to be really important. You may decide to mix by weight instead of by volume so that you can get that precision in that small amount. Because with a smaller amount of material, it's easier to get off mix ratio when you're eyeballing it. So I would recommend a by weight application, but you can add your colorant to the part B of the material, and then when you dispense it from the batch, you'll have that coloration every time. So you can do, again, some color tests in those thicknesses. Like, let's say I know my keycap is going to be like 1/2 inch. I can just let some of that material mix it and let it set up in a mixing cup so that I can see what that color looks like and do some weight tests with that to bring that in line. So great question. I would recommend, though, always trying with a smaller unit for your testing. That's why we offer these fantastic trial size units, so that you aren't opening up material that is going to take you a lot longer to use for something so small. So that's where these might be a great place to start for those small scale tests to help reduce the cost of your experimentation. We're going to let this set up and move on to something else at this point, but I want to show you 2 examples of different ways this could turn out and what I meant by, with that coloration, right? We looked at this one just a while ago where the colorant is much darker. So here, let me hold that up, make that a little easier to see. So same colorant, So Strong Blue. It's just a larger concentration of it has been added because we knew this was a thin part. So to help make that appear darker, like a deeper part of the ocean, it ended up being a larger concentration of pigment. That being said, these pigments do have a loading range. You don't want to go over a certain percentage of proportion of color. That's going to be on the technical bulletins, the instructions for use for the colorants themselves. And you may see coloring recommendations on the technical bulletin for the material you're working with also. But you can see these are both from the same mold, both very glossy surfaces. In fact, has a little bit of texture there. And 2 very different effects with those different colorants. In fact, you can, even without adding that opacity with the filler, you can actually get marbling effects just with different colors. So you can mix different colors, and while they're in that liquid time frame of their pot life, you can actually get blended colors, or you can apply them in layers, just like we saw. Okay. So This is a smaller application, but this wouldn't give us a lot of time to work if we were doing a larger mold, if we were going to be scaling up our process. So if we cast into a larger mold, which is what we're going to do today, we're going to go ahead and cast into this one. That's not a lot of time to mix as much material as we need in here and give that material a chance to let those bubbles rise to the surface and escape. And that's where we will use equipment to help get those bubbles out a little faster. So to do this casting, to create a casting in a mold like this that's on a larger scale, I'm going to want a different product in the Smoothcast 325, 326, and 327 color match series. I'm going to use the one that gives me the most time. That's going to be the Smoothcast 327, and I'm going to use a vacuum chamber, like the one that you see here, to help pull vacuum on the material to help get those bubbles out of entrapment. So I have a perfect example here to show you of exactly what I'm talking about. So this is a clear material. There's a color line in between so you can see the two different sides. Actually, let me hold it like this so you can see with the light. One side of it has been vacuum degassed and one side of it has not. So you can see here that the side that's been vacuumed is giving us that clear appearance, where those microbubbles in the one that has not been vacuumed has really added up to create some opacity, right? Because you're seeing through all these very, very tiny bubbles. So I want to help this material along and not only give it the time it needs for those bubbles to escape, but by pulling vacuum after I mix the material, all that air that I agitated in is going to be helped out so that it has more time to release any remaining bubbles and give me a much more clear casting. So why don't we go ahead and do this? We can move this one off to the side. It's not a liquid any longer. I'm not seeing any shift. It just needs more time to fully cure before I demold it. In fact, the Smoothcast 325 has a very long, what sometimes we refer to as a more flexibility to it with its gel state when it can still be deformed. Like if I pulled that casting out right now, it could be deformed very easily. There's a great video showing this with this example that Milo made that you can actually see an example where the material was manipulated and even tied to a knot. So that's a fun one to check out. So you can see what I mean about that longer gel state in that thinner section. So that's why we're not going to demold that yet. We're going to give it time to reach its full physical properties before we demold it. But we are going to make a little bit of room here. To bring over this equipment. While we're talking about flexibility and we're moving things around, I do want to mention that with these clear castings that you see, not all of these castings are rigid. Some of the casting materials that we offer are just as clear as you get with a crystal clear series, but they can actually bend and flex. So we offer the Clear Flex series in a few different hardnesses. If you find that you want a part that's water clear, but also has a little bit of impact resistance and flexibility to it, keep in mind that we also offer the Clear Flex series of materials too. Okay. So we have our vacuum here, and I'm actually going to bring it over just a little so you can see it better. Now, one of the nice things about the Task 9 product is that Task 9 product actually gives you a little bit more working time too. If you find you need just a little more pot life for some of this different equipment. So with the vacuum chamber, this is the smaller vacuum chamber that's offered. We actually have a 5-gallon unit as well that we do offer too. If you're doing a larger project, having that extra space can be really helpful. And you'll need an appropriate vacuum pump that can pull 29 inches of mercury. That's really important because if you're not reaching that with your vacuum system, then you can actually incorporate more bubbles into it. You'll see that in a moment. We're going to watch this material bubble. So we want to dispense out enough material to fill this mold. I'm going to move the mold out of the way just a moment while we prep our material. And on our website, we do have more information and some great videos you can watch seeing the vacuum degassing process. We're just going to do some of that here for you so you get a better idea of how that works. And because it's a larger example, we're going to pour a little more material, so we're using a gallon unit. I want to walk you through the process of something like this. First of all, I always make sure that my lids are very tight, because an important part of the casting process and the mold making process as well is pre-mixing your material. So you'll see on the container, mine says shake before use. So, great, I have that the right way. So I want to make sure that's nice and tight, and then I'm going to shake my material to help constitute those liquids uniformly when I dispense it out. Okay. I'm going to do the same thing with my part A. And I'm going to prepare some larger containers to mix into. All right. I've got my protective equipment on, so I'm ready to go. And actually, I'll start with the part A. Now, sometimes people have a hard time estimating how much material they might need to pour into their mold. We have a really great material calculator, and it takes into account how much space the liquids take up. Sometimes you can calculate that if you have an object that has geometry that allows you to do that. Another way I've heard that, and have done myself, that some people find successful is to actually pour, for example, pour water into your mold or rice and dump that out to figure out how much space you need to fill up. I've already used this mold, so I have a good idea of how much space, how much volume I need to fill in it, which is what I'm dispensing out now, but we have some wonderful tools to help you do that a little easier. I will say, again, polyurethanes don't like moisture, right? So if you try that water technique, make sure your mold is completely dry before you cast into it. My mold has been prepared with a release agent. Now, with silicone, when you have a fully cured silicone mold, the use of release agent is optional, but it can help you significantly increase the performance life of your mold if you use an appropriate release agent every time. To get a glossy result, now that my mold is completely cured, it's okay for me to use universal mold release on the cured silicone. I can't pour silicone against it, but to cast urethane systems into it, it gives me a very glossy effect. So this mold has been prepared with universal mold release for when I cast into it. Actually, let's just see how much space we'll need. I think that we can leave it on so you can see this whole mixing process and the vacuum and have all three components. Yep, can you see everything there? Here, why don't we get just a little bit more room? How about that? Here you go. Thank you so much. Okay, now we have more space, right? So that's what we're going to pour into. I want to make sure before I do anything, oh no, that won't fit, that I take out the interior component so that I have more room for my container, right? Okay. Perfect. I'm going to take my part A and my part B and mix them together. That's okay. That's why we have the paper here. And then just like before, I'm going to mix my part A and part B of our Smooth Cast 327. And because I have a larger mass of material, that exothermic heat is going to affect it a little more than that thin section that we were doing. So we've decided to use a material that gives us a longer pot life and cure time, but mainly pot life so we can get that liquid into the mold before it goes from a liquid to a solid state. Again, plenty of time to thoroughly mix, scraping the sides and the bottom, and then I'm going to transfer that mix.
So we have an interesting question about rotocasting. Smoothcast 325, I've seen people rotocast that, but I don't think I'd recommend something like the 327 just because of the speed of it. It's slower than the 325.
That is a fantastic question. So the question is about rotocasting these materials. Is the 327 an option for rotocasting? Well, there is a little bit of a difference between slush casting and rotational casting, right? Whether you're using equipment or you're doing it by hand. I agree that trying to slush cast this by hand for its full pot life would be a long time, especially when you're doing layers. So I wouldn't recommend it for that. I think that the 326 or the 325 could be a better option for you unless you're doing a very large model and you're using that additional equipment. But since we have just a moment, I can show you a rotationally cast example since it just came up. So this is a rotationally cast example where it has been cast into a mold in two separate pieces. So when we're talking about rotational casting, we're talking about a mold where the material has been poured in and then the mold has been turned around and fully covered. So we have some great videos on rotational casting and slush casting. There are some featuring this process on our website that I definitely recommend checking out. I think using a material that has a more gradual profile that cures more evenly in those thin sections can be helpful, such as our Smoothcast 65D or our 57D, which have been designed for rotational casting. There's some great videos featuring that, as well as our Task 15 is another option for rotational casting. Sometimes these materials that in the Smoothcast series may be a popular option for people who are trying to cold cast, where they might just be brushing a layer on a surface. So it's been thoroughly mixed. Have I done a double mix with it yet? Yep, I believe so. Great, then we are good to go. All right. We're in our pot life, so I want to use that time to our fullest advantage, right? So we're going to go ahead and turn on our vacuum, which it has an on button. Sorry, it's going to be a little loud here for a moment. And then I'm looking at the dial and just securing it to make sure that the dial is going. Here, try and turn that towards the screen. So you can see that dial moving upward to 29 inches of mercury. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. I can hear the sound that it's working. and I can see the dial going up. And you can see the bubbles that were mixed in when we mixed it and integrated in are now getting bigger, and the vacuum is pulling them up to the surface. So you're going to see these bubbles increase in size. And then this is helping pull them with the vacuum up from the material and allow it to release upwards. We're going to let it go just a little bit more. I like to vacuum degas it until I get a separation in those larger bubbles and can see the material into it, which should happen in just a moment. So I can see that those smaller bubbles are getting bigger and bigger and starting to fall. We do have recommendations on vacuum degassing on our website, as well as some videos you can see, even videos vacuum degassing clear resin. And I can see now that it's starting to fall. I'm looking just a little bit more. I like going just until I can see it clear up on that surface. So it went from rising and bubbling and foaming to falling, and now I can see that amber appearance coming through and separating on that surface. And that's usually when I stop vacuum degassing so that I don't incorporate more air into my mix. So I usually let it go about 30 seconds to a minute longer after I see that initial fall. And now to be able to take it out of the container, because vacuum's on it, I'm releasing that air so you can hear that air hissing out. I'm releasing that air so you can hear that air hissing out. And that'll cause the pressure gauge to drop. Until all of that vacuum is released, so that I can then take this off. If there was any vacuum left in the chamber, it wouldn't allow me to lift this. And you can see those bubbles are almost completely eliminated visually. Now, this isn't the best option if you want a bubble-free casting. That's going to be pressure casting, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But I just want to have as much time as I can, and I'm okay with this being mostly reduced in bubbles and not being completely bubble-free. I just want a clear result. So again, I'm going to the lowest point in my mold, and I'm allowing that material to rise to meet its level. And some of the surface tension on the mold also is going to catch some of those bubbles, right? So there are times where you may see recommendations as well to preheat your mold for even better results too, especially with the Crystal Clear series. That's something that we recommend to reduce that bubbles and help you get better results in your castings, reduce suck back and corner rounding and things like that. We're almost there. You can see why it's important to make sure your mold's level when you make your mold so that you don't overflow and have leaks. Now, I'm going to stop and show you something very dramatic because I was telling you about releasing the surface tension of bubbles. When I use that heat on the surface, see those break? That's just to help the bubbles escape off the surface. I don't want to have a concentrated heat. I'm just lightly applying it because I don't want to increase the temperature and have the material set up faster in some areas more than others. So it's just a light heat just to allow those bubbles to escape right off the surface. So that's vacuum degassing with the material. And I have another mold here that I want to show you and pour a little bit into. this is the mold from the casting I showed you earlier. And this is a little more advanced, but it's important to know with clear castings when we were talking about getting that texture on the interior that you would need a plug to fill in that interior of your casting. So this is unremarkable as a one-part mold, right? It's open, so it's not cut into separate parts. I could cast into this and have a solid result all the way to the top. But what I've done is I've cut the sides here so that I can access the handles, and I have a plug that is going to go down into the interior and rest where I want it to be. So this is our Mold Star 15. It's more flexible and will make it easy to demold the high details on that mermaid. And this is the Mold Star 16. It's very close in hardness, but has a faster pot life and cure time. And I'm just gonna show, well, yeah, we'll pour right into the side if you can see there. I'm gonna pour this material that I vacuumed into my mold. And I'm actually, because we were asked about it, I'm going to slush it around my surface just a little bit down there. This is what we were talking about in terms of demonstrating like a slush process. But I want to leave this poured. I'm not going to do that for the whole pot life to get a thin section part. I'm going to let the plug do that work for me. So I'm going to go ahead and apply that cavity plug. And that's going to push the material all the way up to the top. So that filled in. So I don't know if, yeah, can you see the liquid coming through all the way at the top of those handles? Yep. And that's helping me reduce where that air might get entrapped floating up to the top of the mold. I'm actually just doing a cast, just a very small amount more. Because this is exactly where I want it to be, right up to the top. So that's another option. We have a really cool example of making a thin-walled part as a bottle that you actually see on our website, where you can see some different options for creating a thin section with a clear casting. But for right now, I want to move on just a little bit to talk about our pressure chamber. We're going to let these set up over here off to the side, so we have a little more space to work with. We're okay. I think so. Yep. Okay. That'll be just fine. So you might get confused as to the difference between a vacuum chamber and a pressure chamber if you've never used them before. So we just saw that the vacuum takes the air that we mixed in and it helps pull it up and helps it escape, where normally it might need more time to do that. The pressure chamber works a little bit differently. And the chamber itself, just to give you an idea of what it looks like. They also have a 5-gallon option that can roll. And these are designed to handle up to the 60 PSI that we recommend. And what's actually happening when you use the pressure chamber, so it's not in use right now, it doesn't have any pressure on it, which is why these handles are down. When you use the pressure chamber, you actually have very secured bolts that allow you to evenly apply pressure on it. There's a really cool video that you can see to see how this works, but you're going to leave it in there for the full cure time of your mold if you intend to cast with a resin that you're also going to want to put pressure on. This is going to be the best way to get a result that is completely bubble-free. Now, we're not going to demonstrate that for you because you can't see what's happening in there, but I can show you some results to give you a better idea of what's occurring. So this sample, like the one we were looking at before, actually has on the top crystal clear that has been both vacuum degassed and pressure cast. So you can see there is not a single bubble in there. That is as clear as that can get. where this is the material without vacuum degassing or pressure casting. So you can see why we recommend that. Now, there might be times where this may be within tolerance for you. If you're rotationally casting, for example, you're going to get bubbles entrapped in your material just from part of the actual slushing process. But if you can pour it, then you can, using a plug, for example, get a thin-walled part that is bubble-free, if that's what you're looking for. But I can show you a little bit of what's going on in the chamber. And I mentioned this, I have a mold that was made of a part that was a bottle, just a thin plastic bottle. And you can see that has completely collapsed under the pressure. So I'm showing you this because I want to make sure you understand that if you pressure cast, you're also going to want a model that can withstand that pressure as well. If you have something that's hollow like this, that's very thin-walled, that can easily collapse, you're not going to get the results that you're looking for. Do we have any other questions about vacuum degassing or pressure casting before we look at some of our colorants too?
One of the things that came up, obviously, we're going to use a pressure pot, which isn't, designed for paint. We're going to use something that's designed for casting. But the other point was about like a two-part mold. You'll definitely need a reservoir or a funnel or something on that mold so that the air pressure in the pressure pot can press down on that resin and collapse those bubbles. That
is a great point and something that's really important there. So when you have pressure adding, it's making everything more dense that's in there. That means that the material in your casting that you would pour it up to the top, it's going to settle down just a little bit. So you want to make sure that you have some additional material that can flow in there, because you're not going to be able to open up the pressure chamber afterwards to add more material to it. You want those bubbles to stay very small for that full cure time. So by having a reservoir, like having a funnel where more material can flow down into it, you're giving yourself a little bit more material that's going to flow in, and in doing so, make sure that you get the full shape of the casting and that it doesn't ultimately end up underfilled. There are different ways to do that, but adding, we do refer to that as a reservoir, so that the liquid can flow down a little further. So yeah, that's a really great point and a really helpful tip. I can tell you, if you want to see what's going on in your mold, we have some really cool materials. Let me grab one, for example, that are our Sorta-Clear series. They're Sorta-Clear in appearance. And what I like about these molds, sometimes I'll use them when I'm doing color match, but you can see this is the back side of my mold, and this is the front side of my mold there. So what I really like about them is if I want to see what's going on, if I have bubbles that have gotten entrapped because of my mold shape that aren't escaping, I can see that occurring in my casting with a translucent, in this case, it's not completely water clear like we were talking about, it's more translucent, but I can better see what's going on in my mold, so I can see what's happening in that reservoir after I cast before I even open it up. One of the really nice things about the Sorta-Clear series is that when you cut your mold, you can better see where your model is in it, so when you go to cut it, you can make much cleaner registration cuts in your mold. So we do have some materials both in our near clear as well as in our Sorta-Clear. It's just they may not be compatible with the materials we're talking about right now. So as I was saying, there's some very specific mold rubbers that are compatible with the Crystal Clear series, which is why we're using them today. But for other materials, such as the Smooth Cast or the Task 9, those would definitely be options. Okay. All right, why don't we look at some of the different results you can get? Because one of the things about having fun with these materials is being able to make many different castings that have completely different appearances. So here's that crystal matrix that we had before, right? So initially, it looked like this. So with the So Strong colorants, I can get that clarity all the way through, and if I want, I can go in and paint that too. So there are ways to help ensure you have a more paintable casting. Sometimes I want that to be as glossy as possible. Other times I might be preparing my casting to receive paint. I can tell you that sometimes even if your casting is ready to receive paint, you might actually want a casting that has a little bit of texture designed in it to help hold the paint better depending what you're looking to do. But I can accentuate those color effects in a painted example if I wanted to, or I was talking about layering them, but you can also let them blend together. Like this was actually 2 layers of Smoothcast 325. The top layer is a blue and the bottom layer is a green. It was for a display piece. And on this example, I actually, on the original model, when I sculpted it, I used an acrylic paint. And I went in and I painted the surface of my model so that I could get all these movements of the waves, that those waves are part of the original sculpture. It was a clay, a sulfur-free clay that I painted on top of. I actually used the Sculptex clay. And then I took a thick toothbrush and I painted it. And then I made the mold knowing that I would have a glossy water surface, but I'd also get the movement of the water. So I was thinking of that when I did it. We showed and we mixed some So Strong together, but we also have a series of colorants, which are called UVO, and they're UV resistant colorants. But they also add opacity to the casting. So I have a clear one here that we were looking at before, right? And then this is the So Strong, so you can see didn't take away from the clarity. But the UVO, even though it also gives you a very vibrant result, you can see that opacity there that came with it. So we do have a series of colorants that are very vivid and can add opacity. And then we have a really cool comparison video, so you can actually see them poured side by side, so you can compare the So Strong to the UVO colorants. We also have a series of powders which you can add. So this was a casting that David Heaton made here for us, that you can see the Cast Magic and the So Strong was used together. This is a darker blue example, right? Like we were looking at different concentrations can give you really different effects. But what I wanted to show you is that if you have a thin section of color, even if it's the same color, it looks very different, right? Because it's not that thickness all the way through in terms of color concentration. So that's why I was recommending those thickness color tests earlier. We also have a series of colorants which are called our Ignite series. And our Ignite series can even respond under blacklight, I believe. But they're more of an electric fluorescent appearance. I do want to be very clear that it's the Ignite series of fluorescent colorants that you see here. We do also have fluorescents for different chemistries too, but they also can add a very, very dynamic and different color effect. And we do have some challenges when we talk about another color, which is the red. And I want to discuss this really briefly because sometimes when, isn't this an incredible casting? When you do thin-walled castings, you really see the difference in that color between the thicker sections and the thinner sections. This is all one color consistently through, but Milo made this example, and there's a really great video to go with it. I really recommend it because imagine that you're starting with a pine cone where it's very thin, and the mold rubber is going to have to come out to let that pine cone go and let those castings go in very thin sections. So what I want you to know about the red is that the Smoothcast 325 is an option for the So Strong Red, but there is a unique feature of the Smoothcast 326 and 327, where if you want red, you'll be using UVO, but the So Strong Red specifically is not an option for those series. It is an option for the Task 9, and it is an option for the Smoothcast 325. Heather, could I ask for help just for a moment, just to reach this little section that I'm just a little outside of range for? Yep, and that one as well. These are the last two color castings that I really want to show you, and we can talk a little bit more about processing. So if you're doing something that has a very large mass that's very thick, there are products in the Crystal Clear series that are designed for greater thicknesses of casting. So again, we're talking about some smaller scale pieces, but even then you can see the differences between thin pieces and thick pieces. Well, what if you're doing something very, very large? We have a great picture of a crystal clear example that's here, that's on that massive scale. If we can go ahead and pull that up so that you guys can see it. So this is a crystal clear casting that's very, very large. So we also have the Crystal Clear 204 and 206 products, which can give you over the 3 inches of casting, and then I believe it's the 6 inches or above. You definitely want to check out the technical bulletins there, but you'll see different thicknesses and also mass sizes that are recommended. But it is possible to get very large pieces. Now, I will say this one does have a controlled thickness. It's also to get that beautiful appearance. It also has gold inlay that's been applied. If you ever want to see more about that, the artist Kevin McDonald here did a really wonderful YouTube live presentation on that you can check out. But in this case, this is a clear casting where you can see the light passing through it. That is, I don't have an exact scale on it. I apologize about that, but I want to say it's in the 10 to 12 feet range. So very, very cool what you can do with these materials. And then we were talking about painted effects, and I wanted to say this is an example that was made by John Navarro. There's a wonderful example on our website that you can see where the clear casting, we're going to take a look at the back. Look at that. Has been color blended, not to create a water effect, but a different elemental effect, to create a fire effect, and then has been selectively painted in areas. So just because you're seeing these translucent and clear castings doesn't mean that you're going to need that for your whole piece. It's very easy and possible to paint these as well. I want to see, because I know that it does illuminate, I'm going to use a light table here just to see if we can, so you can see when it's lit. And there you go. I wanted to show you that can allow you to do light features, to diffuse light, and even have the eyes glow. Sorry, he only has one eye at a time, but you get the idea. So there's a lot of options that you can do in terms of those color effects. Thank you so much, Heather. All right, so that was what I wanted to tell you guys about for our urethane products, but we have some other materials that are clear that are very cool to use for different reasons. Do we have any questions in the chat? Anything anybody would like to know more on before I transition over? Wonderful, wonderful. So I am going to move this out of the way now that it is no longer in a liquid state, it's in a gel state. So we can just move these off to the side so we have more working area. Okay. And now we get to talk about those encapsulations. I love encapsulations. Encapsulations are super fun. And we do these with our epoxy systems. We have 2 epoxy products that are very heavily featured for encapsulations, and that would be our EpoxyCast 690 and our tar bender. I'm going to grab that in just a second. So we're even going to pour a little bit of the EpoxyCast 690, but I want to show you this gorgeous example that was made by Victoria here at Smooth On. Look at how stunning that is. So this is an encapsulation of flowers, which we're going to talk about some of the challenges with materials like this compared to what you expect and how they actually work. But this thickness is greater than about 4 inches there. This is a table piece that she made, and you can see it was applied in layers, thin layers, over time. See those striations on the side? to get that result. So you don't apply the material all at once. This is one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you guys today, because when you're looking at clear castings, you don't always understand the techniques behind it. You can see it and go, wow, that's impressive, that's clear all the way through, but you wouldn't pour this at this thickness. You would not get the results that you're looking for, and it would generate way more exotherm, which can have a negative effect on the materials that you're encapsulating inside. But you can see that when used in the right ways, you can get those stunning thick results. Thanks. So one of the reasons I wanted to talk about these different thicknesses is because we also have the tar bender product. And we're going to mix some of that epoxy cast in just a moment, but I wanted to show you that the tar bender is a little different. We just looked at a very thick example, right? Well, this one is one where the encapsulation has actually bonded with the container. So we have many mold makers and casters out there that work with the materials and may choose to leave it. Instead of using a mold that's removed, you can make tables this way, or structures where you're actually applying the material inside. And when you do that, what I will recommend, if it's very porous like this wood is, that in your initial layer, you use a thinner coat over the sides of how high you want to go, so it can close off the porosity as you work upwards. So different encapsulates, different substrates, are going to encapsulate in different ways. This one was made with the tar bender, where the one that you saw in the other thickness was made in the Epoxy Cast 690. Now, this example here is also in the tar bender. I wanted to show you this because I think it's really cool. It's more of a ghost flower effect. But the tar bender isn't designed to be cast into these larger thicknesses in layers. It takes many more layers, and it's really designed for thinner applications and coating applications on a vertical. Now, if you want, if that's something that you're looking for in that frosted effect, it worked to encapsulate, but it didn't give that clarity that you saw in that the rose piece. So this is tar bender, just like that example. I recommend that for areas where you might have an encapsulate exposed, because it's a little more viscous, it's higher viscosity, it can better cover over that area and function as a coating as well as an encapsulate.
We did have a question about the flowers that are encapsulated. You can see the striations between the layers.
Yes.
Which you always will, even if you have something in it. Sanding those sides down won't really help that at all, then.
No, it won't. And that's a wonderful question. The question is, how can you reduce seeing those layers? And those layers can always be visible if you have like a very distinct indicator as well. Like, let's say you have an encapsulate in one layer and not another layer. When you do that next layer, they're going to level. You're going to have, because these are liquids, right? They want to go to their lowest point in the container. They're going to do a flat surface. I do want to mention something about that, especially when it comes to encapsulation, is that liquids have a meniscus, right? You see this in drinks where it pulls up at the side and you have a slight curvature. If you don't want that to exist, actually, you know what, the shell one has a good example of it. So what I want to show you is that there is a very, very slight curvature here. You can see just a little curve at the edges when the light reflects on it. But one of the reasons this is so effective as an example is that if I come up all the way to the top of my container, then I'm not going to have as noticeable a curvature, but I need to make sure that my piece is level, because I don't want to have overflow come off of it, because that will cure and can take away from my aesthetics. So that's where it's very important to work on a level surface, but also with your container, you don't want to go over. But if you're under your surface, you can get that curve, you can get that meniscus visible with these liquids. And that's where the question was actually about sanding or polishing. When you're doing a two-part casting, we were talking about this earlier, with these clear materials, I wanted you to know sometimes you may get a seam line, right? It is possible to polish these materials. When they're fully cured, you don't want to polish them too soon, so you want to make sure that it's not going to have any flexibility or could tear when you do it. You want them to be fully cured. You're also going to make sure to wear your safety equipment, right? Because if you don't want to breathe in the urethane or epoxy particles, so that might be, a NIOSH-approved respirator, like I have mine here. If I was gonna process with additional sanding, I would definitely be wearing mine with particle filters on there. But you can polish this all the way up to retain or bring it back to a shine. Another way, we were talking about painting before. A third option, so the first option is to cast something that has a very glossy surface and use a release agent that can help supplement that glossy surface. Another option would be to sand in grits going higher and higher. When it comes to our river tables that customers make out of our materials, we have a sanding process on our website that we can put a link to that helps describe that process of going to the finer and finer grit to get that very highly glossy shine. And another option is to use a glossy paint. There are a lot of different paints out there. Always do a small test, see how that works for you first before you try it to your larger, more critical piece. But you can test different coatings out there. We do have some recommendations on coatings if you're using your part for exteriors. I can say as well, some of these materials have different UV resistance. So for example, the Crystal Clear series, it's an aliphatic system. It is highly UV resistant, but it is industrial and has different processing requirements like we've been talking about all along. So if you're using a part for exteriors and you need that extra UV resistance, like with the examples we were just talking about with the 690, let's say we wanted to use that table outside, you can use a coating on that surface to help add UV resistance, a barrier coat between direct UV and that piece. And that information is on the technical bulletin for the Epoxy 690 as well. But there are many different aesthetics out there. Unfortunately, I can't show you an example of everything. But again, if you reach out to us, we'd be happy to answer any questions you have about any projects that you want to do. Why don't we mix some of it? And with what we were talking about with those different layers, I wanted to show you an example that's already been started. So this is our Epoxy 690. And 2 layers have already been applied because you have a recommended thickness that you don't want to exceed. One of the reasons is, like I was telling you before, as these materials cure, they're going to give off an exothermic heat. Well, for something very fragile like this, that can actually cause the substrate to change in appearance. When it comes to flowers, they're particularly tricky because you want to make sure they're fully dried before you use them for an encapsulation. There are times too where you may want to even coat your surface, especially if you have like a very delicate part that you may want to put on a coating before you encapsulate it. In this case, the flower example like you saw with the 690, nothing's been changed. These have just been applied to the surface so you can see the area where it's still dry and then the areas that are wet underneath. One of the reasons I wanted to show you the Epoxy 690 is because of how thin it goes on, but also we need to use an accurate gram scale to measure this material. So we're going to use a gram scale to dispense it out. And we're going to pour another layer on here. Now, it has a 5-hour pot life, a 24-hour cure time. Again, it's mass sensitive, so in a thinner section, it could take longer. But when you're applying it, I will say a really helpful tip, something to consider, is make sure you have a container available that you can just cover it over, or a cover, so that when you're leaving it out for that longer period of time, you don't have dust or hair fall on that surface. So I just use a Rubbermaid, over the top to just keep each of those layers from picking up any particles that could take away from that clear appearance. So there are some tips and tricks when you're working with different materials and you're looking to encapsulate them. And I'd always recommend doing a test one first, because that way you can learn more about how it performs and works with these materials. But the EpoxyCast 690, one of the great things about working with it is you can even use it in molds. You can cast into molds. And that might be an option for someone who doesn't have access to the vacuum degassing or pressure casting to allow even more time for the bubbles to escape entrapment if you're looking for something water clear, which is why it's a popular option even for making lenses as well. Okay, I think we have everything that we need. Let's dispense some out, and I'll just show you how low viscosity this material is. Okay. So again, you'll see instructions like on this one, it says stir thoroughly before dispensing out. When you see things like that, that's something you want to do every time. So let me go ahead and do that.
Janessa, what is the mold box made for that encapsulation? What's that made from?
I believe it's the same thing that these containers are made from. The
like HDPE or PTFE?
Yes, PTFE,
okay,
I believe.
Gotcha.
And you can actually do something like this to make your own molds. In this case, it's being held together with compression from these bolts that you see. I can't take credit for it. I actually bought this one pre-made as opposed to making my own. And it's if someone's interested in the mold type, these are sometimes referred to as loaf molds. They're very popular for soap making and things like that. The reason I selected this is it's very easy to take apart. It's not bonding with my surface. I did use a release agent on the surface. You can use the Ease Release 200 with the epoxies. And this mold was already very highly glossy. Now, and that's something too, if you find that the release agent does add a little bit of opacity on your surface, that's something there where you could use a very high grit process to polish that back to a shine too. So hopefully that helps answer your question. All right, so go ahead and stir that up a little bit, making sure that that's reconstituted before I dispense it out. All right. And this one I'm actually just going to shake a little bit. It's lower viscosity. Okay. So this is 100 parts A to 30 parts B by weight. So I already have my gram scale, but I have to tear it out so that it knows the weight of the cup there and goes back to 0. And I'm going to use that mix ratio as my indicator for how much I want. In this particular case, I'm going to literally dispense out 100 grams. I want to make sure that I can read it. You can see the part A is a little thicker. It's just a little bit more viscous, but it's going to combine to a very low viscosity with the part B. All right, now I'm at 90, so I'm going to slow down just a little bit. See how close I can get to the 100. So you just want an accurate gram scale that goes down to at least 1/10 of a gram. Just a little bit more. You know what? I'm okay stopping there. All right. And then in the part B, I only need 30 grams. So have it at 0, dispense out the 30 grams of the part B. Now the colorants for the epoxy systems are a little different. You're going to be using the UVO or Ignite. The So Strong aren't an option for the epoxy systems. So you always want to check the technical bulletin for your material to make sure that you're using the appropriate additives. All right, now we're at 30. You know what? I caught myself. I want to make sure I put my glasses on, doing everything I can to be safe and responsible working with these chemicals. And I'm going to mix that part A and that part B together. So just dispense that out. And even though they were both clear materials, you can see a difference when they get added together, right? you can see a change in appearance that's occurring there as they're mixing. I am going to mix for at least 3 minutes and mix until they're uniform. That's actually what we recommend on our website, on that technical bulletin for the Epoxy Cast 690, that you give it a full working time. Okay, so as a mold maker and caster, I can tell you sometimes when you're mixing, it feels very different than the time that you think that you need. So when you're first starting, or even it's just a good habit to have, sometimes I'll set up a clock in my work area so that I can actually look at it and give myself a visual indicator so that I know what's happening during that time. Really, for me, I'm also looking to make sure that I don't have any of those differences of appearance in the part A and part B. I realize that with clear materials, they can be deceptive in whether they're fully mixed, which is why I always do that double mix process so that anything sticking to the bottoms or the side that might appear unseen doesn't make its way into my final result. Did we have any other questions about any of the epoxies or encapsulation materials?
Yeah, someone brought up an interesting point about epoxies, moisture sensitivity versus a urethane. Obviously, we're using this as an encapsulating material, so
Yep.
I'm assuming that you've got much less sensitivity there.
That's a great point. So one of the reasons that using the epoxies for something like the flowers or for a wood surface, they work very well, is because the epoxies are not as sensitive to moisture inhibition as a urethane system is. When urethanes are exposed to moisture, it can cause it to have an appearance of bubbles or foaming. The epoxies don't do that. So not only are they going to flow very, very thin over the surfaces and allow the bubbles to escape easier, if the surface has absorbed a little bit of ambient moisture, the epoxy isn't going to change how it performs there. What I have seen is, like with the wood I mentioned before, is that once you have that initial layer on, allowing that to coat a porous surface will help prevent bubbles from continuously flowing out of that material because you've closed it off in an initial layer. And you do want to make sure that those layers have cured so that when you put that new layer on top, with the epoxy systems that we're talking about, you don't displace that layer underneath. You don't want that to be in a gel state where you put it on and it can blend into it or push that material out of the way. All right, you know what, that's good enough for the moment. I'm seeing that this is completely mixed. Let's just transfer it into a container and mix just a little bit more. With 5 hours, I have lots of time to make sure that I'm thorough in my mixing. I can actually show you an example where a porous surface like a stone was coated, and it actually does something a little different than a full encapsulation here. I'm using this example because, again, I can take it out of a containment field. Another option would be to use a silicone mold to cast into, which the example that you saw with the roses, it was a very glossy silicone mold, which meant no release was required for it. And it was very easy to demold and get that very high gloss in that surface. But there may be times where you might want an encapsulation within a construct, or it might even be part of your design. When we talk about the silicone encapsulations in a moment, I'm going to show you some where obviously the container is a very important consideration when you're using the material. So I have a full mix on the material, and I'm going to stay in one place and let the material flow again to rise to meet its level. So I'm actually going to start at the top here. And this is one of those hard things about doing the clear casting is I have a visual reference for myself where I'm looking to make sure that it's flowing over the whole surface, and I'm looking for those, kind of reflections to see where it's flowing, yep, you can see that line of material that's flowing across. I'm also going very gently. I recently did an encapsulation of a butterfly and found that the pressure of the resin itself was enough to actually break that wing. It's the same thing with flowers. They're very thin, and when they're dried, they're very brittle. So I don't want to do a large pour and have the force of that resin displace anything here and release petals and break up the appearance of the design I set out. But you can see, since it's already partially encapsulated, it's not moving. It's just the new layers, the part where the new material is flooding over, that is going to be porous, where the resin's going to flow in very thin and the bubbles flow out of. So, yep. So I'll continue this essentially probably for another 4 or 5 layers till I get that over my surface and I don't have anything breaking through that could be fragile or broken. So when you are doing these encapsulations, they can be a large project in terms of time. You want to make sure you give yourself enough time to do them, and that's why I was recommending having a little cover too, so that in your work area you can help keep particles off of it. You don't want to wait too long before you do your next layer, because not only could you get dust and things in the way of the layer, but you don't want to have delamination. You want to make sure that all these materials, that they'll bond to each other in layers. So you're not going beyond the cure time. You're getting close to that cure time as you can to do that next layer where you're not displacing the layer underneath. Yeah, just had a little drip there. Okay, now encapsulations don't always have to be substrates. Sometimes they can just be particles, which some of them can be like the color effects that we were looking at. Some of them can be all kinds of different objects. But I was telling you that I have an example here that was poured around. So this was actually the Epoxy Cast 690 over stone. So normally something like this, if I were trying to hold a bag of stone, they would be in many small pieces all over. The 690 was poured over the top and it was allowed to drain out. So the container that it was in had holes in the bottom. So you can see there's more of that standard encapsulation that you would expect here, but it's holding that shape that it was cast into, and it's all one piece. It's not going anywhere. These can be really great too if you want to have isolated elements within a larger encapsulation, because you're not going to have as many bubbles coming out of the stone now that it has that initial layer. I wanted to show you what that looks like in terms of closing off that porosity. But then you can have really humble examples. This was the Epoxy Cast 690 with nerds. So these are candies that were just used and encapsulated inside the resin. Actually, I think I'm just going to do this one. Sometimes that effect, depending what you're encapsulating, can be more dynamic than others. So these were beads. Right? Sometimes they call them like a seed bead or something like that, assorted beads that were translucent. And I wanted to show you this because they were slightly buoyant. So one of the reasons that when you do that encapsulation, you want to make sure that you have your piece secured down, whatever the substrate that you're covering sometimes is, if it's light enough, it will actually float to the top of the surface, and then you won't have that uniform appearance all throughout. I realized that with the translucence of this, it might not look as impressive to start, but if you're doing something where you're passing light through it, that changes the whole effect, right? So something to consider is, under what context your encapsulation is going to be viewed and used for. So there's many, many different options out there, but the important part is that the casting material is clear so you can better see what's inside. So doing those small, thin layers is a really great way to do that. All right. Yep. So we were talking about embeds, for example. They don't always have to be small particles. They can be very large particles. One of the things I wanted to show you with this example is that the paint and ink of the dice themselves, because they were made from many different makers, actually flowed out. They almost create like kind of a spirit effect of, the ghost of dice rolls past. But you can see how the glossy quality of your surface also has an effect on how it's viewed inside, as can the shape of your form. One of the reasons I showed you those shells is because I found that having, so these that I was just showing you, I'm going to show you another one with some of our cast magic within it as well, is that I found that having simple model shapes are a great way to really showcase what's inside. Sometimes the encapsulate can be more distracting, and I tend to like when it works well together, when there's an integration in the casting. Okay, so we've discussed our Epoxy Cast 690 and our tar bender materials. We have an example setting up. Why don't we play with some of the silicone encapsulation materials? Specifically, we have one here that's called Encapso K. And we don't need this gram scale anymore because these materials are mixed by volume. And this time we're going to use a container. And the reason we're going to use a container is because this material is very soft. I believe it's a Shore 33A hardness. So it's a soft and flexible rubber. And if I left it out of the container, it would bend or flex. And if it's handled frequently, it could easily tear. Now, this is a glossy mold form that you could just get at a local art store or craft store, for example. They're very commonly used for Christmas balls, right? But in this case, I used it as a container to hold the flexible rubber inside of it. And it can come out. In this case, I'm still handling this example just fine, but I have a much more likelihood of scratching it or chipping it or tearing it. So there's some times where I may just use it and leave it in the container, which Encapso K works great for. Because it's a platinum silicone, it's not going to generate that exothermic heat. So it's much more friendly to a wider range of substrates because it's not going to have that heat as part of its curing process like you had with the epoxy encapsulation materials we were just talking about. And it's also very, very low viscosity. You know what? I want to do, yeah, flower's cool and everything. I love them. And I love this example. It looks like water. It's gorgeous, right? And it's a fabric flower, so I'm not worried about it being brittle. It's very easy to handle. It's not going anywhere. It's bonded really nicely with that container, and this is going to last for years to come. It's just a really, it's a gorgeous display piece. But I have a lot of different interests, and sometimes I enjoy having a prop or something that I can carry around, not just display on the table. So I'm a fan of Ponyo, the little fish girl, and I wanted to be able to have something a little more dynamic that I could carry around with me. Having a little magical fish girl for a friend is always very helpful. So this is the Encapso K, and instead of just pouring it and having it flow around the material, I've actually already started a layer for you. Now, forgive me in that normally I would use a clear catgut strand here so that for the layer that might end up being encapsulated, she has a little bit of a necklace here. You wouldn't even see it. It would be completely clear. So to get this effect, I've actually suspended her. Now, the first layer is already poured. It's not going anywhere. It's set up. So she could stay on that surface and she could just be there, and I'd be happy with her exposed like that. She's not going anywhere. But I think it would be a little neater if we can actually put some water over top of her and show her suspended in this container. So in the initial layer that I poured, that covered up the shells, and those shells were heavy enough that they sunk right down to the bottom. Yeah, I'll use that. Thank you very much. So something to keep in mind is you can always use like a clear cord. I just wanted you guys to be able to see how I did it, and I don't mind if she has a little necklace. No problem there. So I'm just going to trim that cord and set her free to go about her fishy business. And I started the first half with just over half of the container of the Encapso, so we're going to just use the rest of the container to finish that. I don't need that anymore, thank you. Sometimes I wish I had 3 hands. So I'm very grateful for Heather's help today. And you can add colorant with the silicone as well. We have our Silk Pick colorant systems too. I don't need to. I want this to look like water. So I'm just going to pour the rest of this out. So I am pouring by volume my part A and my part B, and that's why it's important to make sure you have nice tight caps. And you can see how low viscosity this already is. So I've dispensed out my part A and part B. I'm just going to use the rest of the container. Anything left we can use on that sunflower that we have all set up. Sometimes it's nice to have an option for that extra material. You know what? I'm going to keep a cup to be able to do my double mix. But other than that, I'm just going to pour my part A and my part B together. You can see it's so low viscosity, those bubbles are already breaking right off that surface, escaping that material. So very easy to get a bubble-free casting with the Encapso K, or not casting, encapsulation, if you don't mind using a container. And again, because it's a clear materials, I'm being even more thorough, just making sure that I'm scraping the bottoms and the sides. I have a complete mix. Then I'm going to transfer that to a double mix just to be on the safe side. See how low viscosity that is? Very similar, very close to water. And the nice thing with the silicone, the platinum silicone really wants to bond to itself. So it's going to reduce any kind of appearance of a line, but also it really is going to want to bond, so it'll look like one illusion continuous effect as if she was swimming right in the middle of that water. All right. So I don't need to hold on to that. We have a thorough mix. We're going to go ahead and fill that up right on top so she's swimming in the sea. Which again, I could always leave her exposed if I wanted to, but it's pretty neat to be able to have a piece that's encapsulated within a clear surface.
What is that paño made out of?
Oh, that's such a great question. Okay, so the question is, what is the figure made out of? I actually cast this paño in Smoothcast 300, and then I hand painted her. So the fact that you guys couldn't tell makes me feel a little bit better about my model painting. Thank you. But yes, this is a urethane plastic resin that the platinum silicone, because platinum silicones are sensitive to the potential for cure inhibition, so I tried it against my surfaces first. And I put the shells in the bottom. That was all one pour. This is just the second pour. And actually, I could go all the way to the top. I'm going to go just shy of the top, so it looks like when I'm carrying her, I'm not going to spill. So she's all set. So then I'll just let her set up, and I believe it's an overnight cure that before I actually go and carry her around anywhere. But it's quite an illusion there that's created So you don't see that line. It looks invisible. It looks like she's just floating there of her own fins. So when I said that that soft silicone can easily tear, that actually can be a really cool feature, especially for props and effects. We have another product which is called rubber glass. And rubber glass is also a silicone that looks water clear. And I'm going to show you why this is a popular one for some different effects, as opposed to leaving it in the container. This is really fun for me. This is one of my favorite parts. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. Because it's easy to tear, that makes it really great. Are you guys ready? For ice effects. So I can just break and tear that. I can even encapsulate something like a bottle and then let it form around it and then break it up. Now, there are times too where I actually might pour an excess of material in an ice cube tray mold that I keep strictly not for food or anything like that, just for my extra material, and I can even pour very believable ice cubes that way too. So you can see how bright and shiny. And this is why when it comes to the Encapso K, for example, I prefer to have it in a container. This is the rubber glass, very easily torn. Great for these different ice effects. I know I'm making the counter all messy, but you can see it held the container. You can still see the lines of the container and picked up the detail of that container really nicely, which is why, depending what you're looking for, if it's something that you want to break or tear, like you could pour it, for example, in a slightly thinner section, it would just be very challenging to demold. So that's our rubber glass and our Encapso K used for encapsulations. They're a lot of fun to try out. Do we have any questions about those? We're coming up to the end of our presentation. We just have a little more fun stuff to talk about, and then we're going to be wrapping up for today. But did anything else? Okay. Well, thank you guys. Why don't we break some more stuff? So we do have a specialty plastic in our urethane systems that I neglected to tell you about earlier. Those of you that might be a little more familiar with our products might have caught it. It is called Smash Plastic. And it is called Smash Plastic because it is very easily broken, but it also yields a very water clear result. So this is one of our specialty clear materials as well, right? Now, there is a recommended thickness that you don't really want to go past because these are typically made for prop effects where you might want to break them but not have someone get hurt. So when I said we were going to make an impact, let's go for it. This is our Smash Plastic. And it very easily breaks so that people don't get hurt as long as you stay within that thickness. I realize that might have been a little quick for people, so I have another one. This one has some texture to it. I will say be very careful when you demold a thin section, just because the pressure of demolding it, you don't want to accidentally break it, like I did pulling this one out this morning. But you do want to wait 6 hours before it is a breakable option when you go to cast it. This one has been cast into a wood mold. I'm showing you this. I am showing you this, again, very fragile in thin sections, because that wood, you can see that wood grain really does add opacity to the piece. Let's have some fun and just, there you go, our Smash Plastic at its best. Oh, man, that's fun. But it's also a very, very safe option to be able to work with to keep people getting hurt when you're doing really cool special effects. I missed one effect that is also urethane effect that is just as dynamic, which is that I wanted to tell you we also have an additive for clear urethane systems called Cryptolyte. And one of the reasons I wanted to show you this is because even though we have all the lights on in the studio, and even though this is a clear casting and we've been looking at clear castings for hours, they can still surprise you. So let's see if I can hold this up so you can see that you wouldn't know unless you had it under UV, like I do here, that this clear casting can actually glow very dynamically. And that's our Cryptolyte additive for our urethane systems too. So right, really cool stuff that you can do with it. But I wanted to be able to show you, and that's glowing that brilliantly, even in the studio with all the lights on. So, you know, you can always make a small sample for yourself in the dark to be able to check it out. But those were all the fun effects and different ways to use these materials that I wanted to talk with you about today. I hope you guys had a lot of fun, and thank you so much for joining us. I do want to let you know we have another YouTube Live presentation that's going to be coming up next Thursday with Milo, casting silicone. Oh, Milo does such a great job. So that'll be at 1 p.m. on May 26th. So don't forget to tune in and join us next time around, and hopefully we can show you a new way to create with smooth-on materials. But thank you so much for joining us today. Take care.